An unremarkable piece of stone, to be found anywhere, you might think. And you'd be wrong. Because this has a fascinating story to tell. A story that saw its beginnings long before the stonemason who shaped and put this here was even born. We have to go right back to the time of Christ himself, to a time when men and women shut themselves away from the temptations of the world to be closer to God. They became hermits. And it was when hermits and other religious people decided to live together in communities that monastic life began. Oh, and this stone? Well, this is part of that grand design, which from small beginnings grew to something as impressive as this. It was many hundreds of years after Christ before other religious people were to build anything like this here in Britain. But once established, communities of monks, canons, friars and nuns were to become a familiar feature of life here for almost 1,000 years. And although this is a ruin now, we can learn a lot about the people who lived, worked, prayed and died in places like this from what remains. To do this, we have to understand a little about the people themselves. We have to visualize walls where only the foundations remain, and floors and roofs, long since gone, from the scars they left on the stonework. So we have to play detective, even guessing at the use of a building like this, for example. But from it all, we can build up a picture of what life was like in those days. It was harsh, difficult, and unattractive to us. But the heritage these men left affects you and I in our everyday life today, and you're going to see why. To begin with, what were they like, these men? Well, this is proof enough of their dedication. You see, there were many different religious orders, but the way of life of most of them followed the rule written down by St. Benedict way back in 520 AD. And he said that the day should be spent in prayer, hard work, and study. And this discipline not only set the pattern of their lives, it also helped to shape their communities and even the buildings they lived in. So the first thing to remember is, although the religious orders may differ, the layout of monasteries follows a similar plan. And we've drawn you a simple example here. Remember that they were usually self-contained communities, sometimes closed to the outside world, a bit like a village that discourages outsiders. And just as village life revolves around the village green, so the hub of the monastery is the cloister. And that's where we are now. A green lawn surrounded on its four sides by a one-story covered way and the buildings of the monastery itself. And how do we know it was covered? Well, here you can see the line of the outer wall, which had open arches onto the cloister green. Now, these arches have been reconstructed from pieces found. And you'll notice that the buildings face into the grass. A reminder, if you like, that the monks should be looking inwards and not out at the temptations of the world. Oh, and up there, on the inner wall, you can see the line where the roof of the covered way was bonded in. So here the monks would sit, enjoying the sun, if the British climate let them, reading, meditating and working. And the monks' work was mainly writing theses on religion and history. This was long before printing, remember. The monks would painstakingly make beautifully written and illuminated manuscripts. They were amongst the few people of their time who actually could read or write. And the monastery was the home of some of the few books in existence. So this was a seat of learning. In a way, the beginning, although don't hold it against them, of school itself. In fact, the novices, the training monks, may actually have been schooled here, because the cloister was also the scene of many daily activities. But it was primarily a walkway connecting the various buildings. They needed somewhere to sleep, to eat, to discuss the daily business, and above all, to pray. The main purpose of the monks' existence was the service of God, and the most important building, the church. And a very impressive church it is. Let's look at the plan again. Now, the church generally runs along the north side of the cloister, and it's usually cross-shaped. That will help you find it if only the foundations remain. And here, you'll always find an entrance into the church, into the nave, where we're standing now. And this great nave, remember, is less than half the length of the complete church. What can we learn from it? Well, we know that the church was always the first stone building erected on the site. This one dates from 1135. And in architecture, it's in keeping with the simple, austere ideals of the early monks. Now, just compare that with the later additions. Just look at that east end, a beautiful example of English Gothic architecture. As the monks began to attach less importance to the simple life, and the abbey grew more wealthy, the church grew larger and more splendid. Traditionally, the church was built so that those who faced the high altar were also looking towards the Holy Land. And by the 13th century, of course, that far east end would have been dominated by a magnificent window of coloured glass, sadly, long since gone. But a great slab marking the site of the high altar does remain. Now, what do you think these are? Well, here, in 2 rows, facing each other across the choir, and in order of seniority, the monks would sit on wooden choir stalls or seats. Of course, they've long since gone, and only the foundations remain. And you have to remember that sort of thing, because the buildings were always being changed, knocked down, or added to. And you have to remember it when looking for the clues. Now, we know that in the 13th century, this would all have been paved. And over here, there's some very attractive examples. Impressive now, but just imagine what they must have been like then. And think of the craftsmanship that went into their creation. After hundreds of years exposed to the elements, they still retain their colour and their glaze. See this line of stone? Now, this is where a screen divided the church. The east end was reserved for the choir monks, and the west end, the nave here, for the lay brethren. And who are they? Well, let me explain. This is a Cistercian abbey, and the Cistercians believed that the true service of God should contain a strong element of hardship and discomfort. They cited their monasteries in the most remote, inhospitable areas. And whereas other orders relied to a great extent on the revenues and the rents from benefactors and local communities, the aim of the Cistercians was towards self-sufficiency. Not only were the choir monks expected to work in the abbey gardens, but they also had a special class of monk, the lay brethren, who farmed the monastery lands and looked after the sheep. They were totally uneducated and not allowed to learn more than the Lord's Prayer. Now, usually, they lived on outlying farms or granges, but when they were in the abbey, then they would use this nave for worship. Now, the monastic day began for the choir monks at 2 a.m., with the first of 7 services of the day. And in most monasteries, you'll find a special set of night stairs, so that the monks could get directly from the dormitory into the church. And here, in the south wall of the transept, is where the night stairs would have entered the church. Well, of course, the stairs and the dormitory have long since gone. But if you look at the plan, you can see where the stairs came down from the dormitory, which ran along the first floor of the east range of buildings here. Now, the keynote to monastic life, which influenced everything they did, including their buildings, was organization and planning. There was a fixed timetable and pattern to their daily existence, which revolved around frequent visits to the church for services. So all the buildings face onto the cloister for the monks' easy access to the church, often walking in procession in a fairly formal way. For example, at 2 o'clock in the morning, as I've said, the bleary-eyed brethren, led by one of their members with a lantern, will come down from the dormitory to the church. And as the services lasted upwards of 2 hours, it's hardly surprising that one of the monks, known as the circator, had to walk up and down to make certain nobody fell asleep. But this ordered existence means that with a little thought, you can predict the use of rooms where little remains. For example, what do you think this is? Obviously, close to the church, they would have needed somewhere to keep the church robes and altar cloths. And this would have been the vestry. And it might also have been used as a library. Now, that may not look much like bookshelves to you, but they would have had wooden book presses or cupboards. And in them, a number of books like this. And we can tell from this inscription that this actual book was in the Abbey library here in the 12th century. But they also had to have a meeting place to discuss the daily running of their community. A part conference hall, part parliament, part court. This room was called the chapter house because the daily meetings began each day with the reading of a chapter of St. Benedict's Rule, the monastic code of practice. It was often a splendid room in its own right. It could be many-sided, oblong, or as you see here at the far end, semicircular. Now, if you take a look from above, you'll see that the chapter house appears to be 2 buildings, one inside the other. That's because it was originally much larger. But as the numbers entering the monastery decreased, so the chapter house was remodeled, and it shrank from that line there to this one here. The monks would sit on stone seats along the sides. The abbot's place was at the east end. And this? Well, this is a grave, because traditionally it was here in the chapter house that former heads of the monastery, the abbots, were buried. Primarily, the chapter house was the place where the daily business was discussed and the jobs given out. It was also the place where any monk who'd done something wrong received his punishment after confessing his sins. And the best clue to identifying the chapter house is at the entrance. Nearly every chapter house had a triple opening from the cloister. Here you can see the remains of a very impressive window. That would have been the doorway here. And you may just be able to make out the remains of another window here. But while the majority were praying, somebody had to run the place. So there were a number of Abbey officials called obedientaries who could oversee the important tasks. Remember, it was a self-contained community. They even had to have their own hospital to care for the sick monks, the domain of the infirmera, hence infirmary. The monks followed the medieval practice of being bled periodically, and the infirmary was the only place in the monastery where they were allowed to eat meat, presumably to build them up again. It was sensible, for reasons of health, to site the infirmary away from the main buildings of the monastery, with access to the cloister through a passageway called the slype. Now here the slype is part of the parlour or talking room. There was a rule of silence in the monastery, and it was only here, and even then at specified times, that the monks were actually allowed to parley or converse. And incidentally, the slype is also the route to the garden, where the monks grew food and herbs for ointments and medicines. Now there were many officials. The services and looked after the books. The sacrist was responsible for the monastery, and he was also in charge of the valuables. Let's see where he kept them. It's not as easy as you might. Just look at the size of that doorway. The lack of access probably means that this was the strong room or treasury. Whew, they weren't taking many chances, were they? Now, although the plan for this range isn't exactly the same in every abbey, all monasteries had to have access to the dormitory above during daytime, day stairs, leading from the dormitory above directly to the cloister here. And there was always access to this room. In winter, probably the most popular room in the monastery. And the fireplace is under giveaway. Originally, this was the warming house. And quite literally, until much later, this was the only building in the monastery where a fire, for the sake of comfort, was allowed. When you remember that the monks slept in the dormitory above on bare boards, then the warming house must have been quite welcome. Oh, and another essential thing, at the end of the dormitory above, running at right angles to it, were the toilets called the rear daughter, with constant running water below, draining down into the river. So apart from the regular services, daily life had to go on. There were always countless jobs to be done. The monastery would have had a forge, a carpenter's workshop, a pottery, possibly even a glassmaker's workshop. There were always things to be made and repaired. And of course, food to be grown. They bred their own fish, they brewed their own ale and wine. And all the food and drink was in the charge of the cellarer, and this is his domain. In the basement, he probably stored his supplies, while above was the refectory or dining hall. But first, let's take a closer look at the basement. And the first thing we see is that the ground floor above was obviously supported on pillars and arching. Now look at this. Notice how the wall is butted onto the pillar. It's not part of the pillar itself. Now, as a general rule, straight joints like that imply that the wall was not part of the original layout. So it's probable that this vast basement area was subdivided into small cellar rooms and storerooms at a later date. In the dining room, the monks would sit in silence to eat their meals. And this is probably what it looked like. But words were being spoken. You see that opening above floor level on the west wall? Well, that was a pulpit. And from there, during the meal, one of the monks would read aloud from the Bible. And how did he get there? Up a spiral staircase. There was an entrance on ground floor level, but there's another one here. When you realize this was erected in the 13th century, this spiral staircase is a very sophisticated piece of building. Along with the dining hall on the south range, you'll also find the kitchen, where we are now. You can see the remains of a large fireplace here, and over in the wall there was a hatchway, so that the food could be handed directly from the kitchen here through into the dining hall. Now, the layout of virtually every monastery was the same. The cloister, with on the north the church, on the east the day, business rooms and the dormitory above, on the south the dining hall and kitchens, and on the west whatever other rooms you need. In some orders, the cellarer kept his stores in the west range, and the prior or abbot had his lodgings up above. But in a Cistercian order, this provided quarters for the lay brethren. Initially, a dormitory up above and a separate refectory down below. At one time, 500 lay brethren were said to be part of this abbey. And even accepting the fact that many might have been away at farms, How the rest might have fitted into such a small range of buildings is one of the puzzles of this particular site. But it's also part of the fascination of exploring somewhere like this. Now, what would you say this is? And before you think about it, perhaps I ought to tell you that it's in two parts, separated by the entrance to the dining hall here. And that's a very good clue. Now, this part is better preserved. Along the whole length here would have run a lead-lined sink. And it was here that the monks would wash before meals. You see, cleanliness wasn't just next to godliness. It was a question of health. The monks would have shaved once a week. They'd have had a bath 3 or 4 times a year. And don't smile. By medieval standards, that was very good. A place like this would have had a very effective sewerage system. And with a fixed community, that was essential. So although their lives may appear dull and unattractive to us, in their day, these were the trendsetters. Here was the pattern for organized community life. They often set the pace for architectural and artistic enterprise, furthering the causes of painting, writing, and music, apart from providing the first libraries and schools. As monasteries came to own surrounding lands and villages, the abbot had the power of a feudal lord, controlling large areas of land and administering justice to all his people. Such was his influence. Henry VIII closed down the monasteries and brought this way of life to an end. But if you know what to look for and use your eyes properly, a day here can be a fascinating trip back into the lives of those who left us this important legacy. Like this here in Britain. But once established, communities of monks, canons, friars and nuns were to become a familiar feature of life here for almost 1,000 years. And although this is a ruin now, we can learn a lot about the people who lived, worked, prayed and died in places like this from what remains. To do this, we have to understand a little about the people themselves. We have to visualize walls where only the foundations remain, and floors and roofs, long since gone, from the scars they left on the stonework. So we have to play detective, even guessing at the use of a building like this, for example. But from it all, we can build up a picture of what life was like in those days. Similar plan. And we've drawn you a simple example here. Remember that they were usually self-contained communities, sometimes closed to the outside world, a bit like a village that discourages outsiders. And just as village life revolves around the village green, so the hub of the monastery is the cloister. And that's where we are now. A green lawn surrounded on its 4 sides by a 1-story covered way and the buildings of the monastery itself. And how do we know it was covered? Well, here you can see the line of the outer wall, which had open arches onto the cloister green. Now, these arches have been reconstructed from pieces found. And you'll notice that the buildings face into the ground. Men and women shut themselves away from the temptations of the world to be closer to God. They became hermits. And it was when hermits and other religious people decided to live together in communities that monastic life began. Oh, and this stone? Well, this is part of that grand design, which from small beginnings grew to something as impressive as this. It was many hundreds of years after Christ before other religious people were to build anything. It was harsh, difficult and unattractive to us. But the heritage these men left affects you and I in our everyday life today. And you're going to see why. To begin with, what were they like, these men? Well, this is proof enough of their dedication. You see, there were many different religious orders, but the way of life of most of them followed the rule written down by St. Benedict way back in 520 AD. And he said that the day should be spent in prayer, hard work and study. And this discipline not only set the pattern of their lives, it also helped to shape their communities and even the buildings they lived in. So the first thing to remember is, although the religious orders may differ, the layout of monasteries follows a an unremarkable piece of stone, to be found anywhere, you might think. And you'd be wrong. because this has a fascinating story to tell, a story that saw its beginnings long before the stonemason who shaped and put this here was even born. We have to go right back to the time of Christ himself, to a time when